Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Media Reformed podcast, seeking truth in an ocean of messages. I'm Quentin Doles. On today's episode, we're going to be digging back toward another older blog post that I wrote sometime in spring or summer of 2021, I believe, about that time that Raunchy Comedies gave surprisingly sound insight on relationships. Now, as a quick disclaimer before I start reading, I've not actually seen either of the films that I discussed in the post, and to be frank, I don't recommend them to anybody, really, due to the content that they contain. At least from what I've read, I've not seen them, so I can't give a personal verification to that. And also, since I'll be talking about a relatively mature subject matter, I'll be talking somewhat frankly about sexuality, not graphically, but somewhat frankly. I'll advise some discretion for anybody who's sensitive to such things, or for any children who are somehow listening to this now. I'll have more episodes that are more kid-friendly in the future for you to listen to. So, in my movie viewing habits, I've tended to shy away from the genre of R-rated raunchy comedies that revolve around sexual humor and gross-out gags. Perhaps it's because I fancy myself too sophisticated and cultured for such trifle things. But then again, I like Monty Python, so that seems unlikely. It's more, I think, because of my own convictions and trying not to walk into temptation by surrounding myself with films that make these sorts of jokes to such a high degree, in addition to the fact that I don't usually find such humor in actuality all that funny. It doesn't mean I've never dabbled in watching things that I wouldn't watch now, but the most popular movies in this genre, whether it be something like The Hangover, American Pie, Bridesmaids, or There's Something About Mary, or others, I've tended to avoid over the years. Since these films usually only have the intent to make people laugh in whatever low means they choose, it's a surprise to me that there were actually two films released just over a decade ago that, despite their heavily sexual nature, actually managed to give some good commentary on modern relationships. Those films are No Strings Attached and Friends with Benefits, movies with virtually the same premise that were released in the exact same year and come close to touching upon something almost profound. To give brief summary, and again this is merely relayed from the Wikipedia plot summaries of the two movies, I have not seen either of them. Each film is about a pair of friends, one female and one male, who decide to try adding sex to their relationship without it becoming an actual emotional commitment. Essentially, they only want the thrill of sexuality without the intimacy and burden of a serious dating/courting/marriage relationship. In both films, this doesn't end up working out the way that they intended, and romance inevitably buds between the two despite their promises to keep emotion at arm's length. Romantic comedy nonsense ensues, and the couple finally acknowledge and confess their feelings for one another, and supposedly live happily ever after. Now, there are certainly still issues that I take with the way that these films play out in this premise, mostly in how sugar-coated and glossy everything seems to turn out in the end. Falls back pretty heavily on the romanticized rom-com formula of some vague notion of true love winning out in the end, despite all circumstances pointing out in the other direction. And they both also seem to equate a mere strong emotional bond with marriage, since neither film, from what I can tell, ends in some sort of marriage ceremony. In addition, as I've already stated, both movies are R-rated, which means that they're both very candid with their depiction of sex, and on that merit alone, I wouldn't recommend them to anyone. However, some aspects of this plot actually capture something interesting about the connection between sexual relations and emotional attachment. At the time that I wrote this, I had heard a couple of recent sermons on this very topic that had made me inclined to write about it in the first place. One was from the pastor at the church where I attend and where I now work, and the other from Pastor Tim Keller, which my own pastor is self-admittedly a big fan of Tim Keller and quoted him extensively in his own sermon, so there's quite a few similarities between the two. A point that both sermons made in this is that sex was not created to be a casual, emotionless activity on the same level as eating or breathing. Nor was it meant to be viewed as a dirty or disgusting act that shouldn't be talked about or thought of, and which only has the purpose of procreation. Rather, sex is meant to be an extension and celebration of intimacy within a covenant relationship of marriage. It was not meant to be taken lightly, nor is it a mere appetite that we must fulfill, but it was meant to keep It was meant to be kept only in the bounds of a committed relationship, in which both husband and wife vow to give themselves entirely to their spouse, physically and emotionally. Not only was sex created by God with the intent of being intertwined with emotional commitment, but the two elements cannot, in fact, be separated. This is the element that the movies develop well. When the couples in each film try to have sex outside of emotional commitment, they do so with the hope that this will give them fulfillment and pleasure without the added pressure. But because the two things were meant to go together, attachment gradually arose anyway. See, our brains are hardwired to react to sex in a certain way, and that way includes a bond being formed with the object of our pleasure. As the Apostle Paul puts it, do you not know that he who is joined to a prostitute becomes one body with her? For as it is written, the two will become one flesh, 1 Corinthians 6:16. Thus, not only is it impossible to avoid emotional reaction and bond forming in sex, but if we abuse this without true commitment, we damage ourselves by forming and then instantly ripping away these bonds. And just as a quick aside, since that verse from 1 Corinthians is presented here out of context, I'm certain that Paul meant to say this to refer to more than just relations with specifically prostitutes, since he quoted a verse from Genesis, which is a more all-encompassing statement about the matter. He probably wanted to specifically address the prostitution that would have been commonplace in the city of Corinth at the time, and thus would have been a temptation to the members of the church there. But anyway, I digress. There's a common perception of Christians that I sense from people outside the church that we have a somewhat backwards, outdated view of sexuality. Some say that it's too limiting and confining, or that we're just trying to be too holy and using our self-righteousness to scoff at and judge others. I won't deny that this latter observation may very often be the case. I think that there are some Christians whose view of sexuality is skewed too far in that opposite direction. I will, however, advocate for the biblical view as being healthier, more fulfilling, and more honorable to the Lord, who designed our bodies and minds and who wants to show us the best ways to care for them. It is not my wish to force these views on anyone, nor do I want to shame the lifestyle that anyone has lived or is living, but I do want to encourage everyone to consider what the Bible has to say about these matters. We live in an age in which sex is becoming more and more casual, and more people are seeking it or other alternate means to fulfill needs they think they have without the effort of cultivating and keeping an intimate, lifelong relationship. We can't have both sexual fulfillment and freedom from commitment. The many issues that tie into this are too complex and plentiful for me to address them all here. But I'll give encouragement by saying that God is far more committed and faithful than any of us ever could be. If we're in a relationship that seems faltering, we can draw on His strength and look to His steadfast love for us. And if we're single and desperate for a relationship like this, we can look to God as the perfect partner with whom we can have our most satisfying and sturdy relationship. Sex is created to be sacred and holy, but we're not meant to define ourselves by it. God must be preeminent, and if we honor Him and His creation in the way it was meant to be honored and enjoyed, He'll be faithful and give us more pleasure and joy than we can even imagine. Thank you very much for listening to this episode of the Media Reformed Podcast. I'll be back very soon with another episode, and until next time, keep on seeking.